Hi students, welcome to week 7. This is lecture 1 and it's going to be about feminist theory. It's pretty much the same drill as last time. We're going to go through the PowerPoint together and I'm just going to kind of explicate some of the more complex terms for you. So last week we kind of looked at the beginning of assignment 2 and also Marxist theory, and we started applying it to Zora Neale Hurston's wonderful short story Sweat. We looked at how to start assignment 2, the annotations, and we also began to think about how we might kind of get that done by the deadline, okay? Just to recap, your assignment 2A, the annotations, is due at the end of this week, so make sure that you get that in, okay? So this is lecture 1, this is on feminism. Your next lecture is going to be on post-colonial theory, and that's going to pop up on Thursday. This one, of course, is on Tuesday. The week after that, we're going to be having a week just where we draft and where we focus on the podcast assignment. So for that one, you will be actually getting into groups and meeting face-to-face. But again, we'll be talking about that more next lecture, and I'll be sending an email about groups, okay? So don't worry about that for now. So, okay, what I'd like us to do is I would like to, if you turn to slide 4, you can see that the readings for this week, I asked you to look at Rivkin and Ryan's introduction, as usual, into feminist paradigms and gender effects. I then asked you to look at Gail Rubin, The Traffic in Women. Quite a complex text. If you found yourself thinking, I don't really understand this, that's okay. I also asked you to look at Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's The Epistemology of the Closet. So you've got 2 wonderful essays there. Now you might have heard of the latter one. The latter one's quite famous. So slide 5 then. Feminist theory evolved in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That's when we really think of the kind of second wave of feminism, the very militant wave. Of course, feminism's been around for eons of time. You know, whole eras have been dominated by women. Amazonian tribes in the rainforest have been run by women. It's, you know, it's not a new idea to have a society based on, I guess, questioning the treatment and representation of women. However, the thing that we need to remember is that it really wasn't a way that we began to look at literary texts and history until the 1960s and 70s. One of our most famous feminist critics is called Germaine Greer. You might have heard of her. She published a really famous book called The Female Eunuch. It was kind of the first feminist text to really go mainstream, as it were. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics around the same time. This was a very, very well-known feminist text. And Millett famously criticised male authors such as D.H. Lawrence, the British writer. He's a modernist writer, same era as Conrad, they were actually friends. She really criticised people like him and the way that they presented women. Whether the criticism was just, I'm not sure, to be honest. It's a very sweeping statement to make, and there are cases for both sides. So if you have a look at this quote here from Rivkin and Ryan, the movement very quickly leapt across ethnic and gender boundaries. We can think about this with Sweat. African-American feminist scholars like Mary Helen Washington, Barbara Smith, and Bell Hooks depicted a history of African-American women's experience along the twin axes of race and gender that had a unique specificity. Now, what they're really saying here is that very quickly this became something, I mean, all women are united in the theme of struggle or power issues or male subjugation. So this is something that really does cross class, race, you know, all sorts of boundaries that normally exist in society. So there's a power to it, there really is. Slide 6. And again, slide 6, you've got that little speaking activity, little speaker. So if you want to hear me kind of, you know, give little more kind of snippets, then do use that. So there's a link between feminism and Marxism. There's a reason why I do Marxism in week 6 and feminism at the start of week 7. And that's because, if you remember rightly, Marx argued that the relative position of individuals in society could be determined by many things: slavery, estates, classes, patriarchalism. Patriarchy, call it what you like, pronounce it how you like. In other words, patriarchalism can determine the position of individuals in society, mostly women. So, of course, remember, patriarchalism is the idea of patriarchy, that males are kind of dominant in society and females are subjugated or subject to their will. Again, we don't really live in a patriarchal society anymore necessarily in the States, but I'm sure it wouldn't take us too long to think of a country where patriarchy still reigns large. So an activity I'd like you to do, I'd like you to find an example of a scene in both Heart of Darkness and The Bell Jar that touches on issues of patriarchy. Think about the role of the intended in Heart of Darkness. Kurtz's intended. Really think about what she's there to show. Is Conrad merely a sexist who's presenting women in a subjugated role, or does he actually want us to question, challenge, and subvert Kurtz's sexist presentation of the intended as someone who's there to do no more than shine his boots and tell him what he wants to hear? It's up to you again. I'm not going to tell you what to think on that. Now, The Bell Jar, I don't need to explain, that The Bell Jar is a feminist text, or at least a text that touches on issues of feminism. Chapter 6, I thought it sounded just like the sort of drug a man would invent. There's plenty of examples in The Bell Jar. Think about the birth scene. You can really read feminism into that. So try and find a couple of scenes, maybe something that links feminist ideas, and then you can actually start thinking about how these compare. Again, what I'm really gearing you up to do is think about assignment 4, which is when you will analyse a text with the idea of 3 theories. So you could pick one of these scenes now and then you'd have it ready and prepared for assignment 4. On to the next slide. So Rivkin and Ryan's introduction. On this slide, I give a little bit more example. And again, if you look at the second bullet point, it says the subject of feminism was women's experience under patriarchy. The long tradition of male rule in society which silenced women's voices, distorted their lives and treated their concerns as peripheral. To be a woman under such conditions was in some respects not to exist at all. And again, we might now think, really, this still goes on. We can all think of at least one country in which women are still subjugated. And of course, the gender pay gap, the fact that still women are hired in on lesser rates. This is something that still does exist. And of course, in recent years, it would be worth noting, it's not just about subjugation of women, of course. We have to look at the ways in which perhaps men are subjugated as well in society in certain ways. So, there are very different perspectives that we must engage. Let's move on to the actual feminist essays then. This slide here, slide 8, published in 1975, The Traffic in Women is a seminal text. If you use the word seminal, S-E-M-I-N-A-L, it means key. Absolutely, you can't read feminism without reading this text. It's a seminal text in the development of feminist theory. Now, the key things to think about here, I'm not going to go over all these quotes, but you want to be looking at the following. How Rubin connects the idea of Marxism into her own reading. What she basically argues is that Freud and Strauss, because they're all about talking about history, and Marx as well, but more Freud and Strauss, she argues that because they talked about history, they actually unintentionally recorded the unfair conditions of women living in that history. They didn't mean to be feminist, but what they did was shone a spotlight onto women's issues. But they didn't try and tackle these issues. In fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest that someone like Freud actually did some damage to women's rights. Something that Freud did, for example, was he perpetuated the idea of hysteria and neuroses. Hysteria was something in the 1890s that only a woman could be diagnosed with. You couldn't be diagnosed with hysteria if you were a man. You had to be a woman. There were all sorts of awful things done off the back of this. If you want to look at something truly disturbing, Google something called the rest cure. The rest cure was the belief that if your wife showed any sorts of signs of complaint or bother, you could pretty much lock her in bed and starve her or put her on a special diet for as many weeks as you wanted. And that was fine. That's all. Again, you can imagine ridiculous, profoundly sexist at heart in every way. But that's just an example of how subjugation of women was, very, very rife up until, again, we're still seeing it now in some sectors of society. So that's the first thing you want to think about, the connection to Marxism. Rubin argues that Marxism leaves a kind of hole, historical readings leave a bit of a hole. Therefore, we need to find a way to theorise the position of women in society. Therefore, feminist theory offers that way. Now, again, sounds obvious now. In the 1970s, when Rubin was writing, this hadn't really been done before. Not in a kind of conscious, I'm going to theorise this way. Have a look at let's have a look. Okay, last quote. Rubin's arguing that there's something in society or parts of it that facilitate the oppression of women. She calls these parts the sex gender system. This is the term that you need. Here we see Rubin's definition of the sex gender system at play. The unfair treatment of women, reflects this sex gender system. Fine. Turn on to the next one. Again, I'm giving you a little bit more information here about why she introduced this Marxist theory, giving you a little bit more detail there, giving you some good quotes that you can use. Again, I try and do these readings so that I want you to do them, but I know that you have to have some guidance through these readings. I remember from my own literary studies course, you have to have your professor say, yes, this is the right stuff to be looking at. And no, you don't really want to focus on that too much. That's okay. So again, all the key quotes are in here. I've given you a writing response task. I'd like you to spend the next 10 minutes writing down your response to that. Okay. So 10 minutes have gone by. This is what I'd like you to do next. Have a think about what Rubin actually argues. Again, I've given you the key quotes here. Now, something really interesting is if you have a look down at the last bullet point, what she actually says is that sometimes oppression in the sex gender system can come not just from patriarchy, but from other sources. Patriarchy implies that a man has to be in some way a father figure or a figure of authority. And actually the power of males in these groups, she says, is not founded in their roles as fathers or patriarchs, but on their collective adult maleness, embodied in secret cults, men's houses, warfare, exchange networks, ritual knowledge, various initiation procedures. I'm sure we can all think of an example even in modern day times. I know there was one in London when a long-standing men's club, like clubs that posh people go to in their lunch hours in London, very, very expensive old boys clubs. You pay about $17,000 for a year's membership. We kind of have evidence now to suggest that these can be, I'm not saying can be, not always, but can be construed as an instrument of male dominance or male power from which women are excluded or marginalised. Again, I'm not saying that's always the intention, but we can see this maybe. Rubin talks about how this is something that happens in society. So in other words, it's not just patriarchy in itself that subjugates women. It's all of the institutions, orchestrations, societal constructs through which that's kind of enabled that also subjugate women. Think about that for Sweat. Remember how the men get together and talk about Delia. There's that uncomfortable manifestation of maleness when they kind of get together and talk about her in quite demeaning ways. That's a really good example. Now, again, I'm not saying you couldn't flip that. If you find an example of where women seem to get together and kind of demean men, then you could argue that this perhaps is a collective adult femaleness, maybe. So you can flip it if you want. Next slide, slide 11. Now, this is the key thing. This is where the title comes from. But interestingly, she actually barely uses this term, the traffic in women. I've put some really key quotes here. This is where she links capitalism and the traffic in women. But she also, again, says actually it's not just in capitalist societies that this takes place. Think about this for Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness in the Congo is not yet established as a capitalist society. It's an African society that's been overrun by colonialists. So it's not really capitalist, but it's kind of getting there. It's that uncomfortable mix of a native society versus a colonizing society. And yet there's still definite elements of the oppression of women in that society. Again, think about the intended. So as Rubin says, it doesn't have to be a capitalist society for that sort of oppression to take place. She also talks about how certain systems facilitate this traffic in women, exchange. Think about people trafficking. It doesn't just mean people trafficking. It means just the ways in which women become kind of no more than commodities. They're passed between people, that sort of thing. Again, the intended is a really good example of this. She doesn't even have a name. She's called the intended. The intended to do what, I mean, intended to marry, but is there another innuendo to that? Are there expectations on this woman? Probably. So have a think about what the actual exchange in women, the exchange of women, that's probably a better term than the traffic in women because Rubin uses that more often. Think about what that means. Again, I've given you plenty of quotes there that you can apply. So a couple of questions here that I'd like you to just engage in on slide 12 before you continue. These will really, really get you to kind of refresh and stop and have a little think. Before we move on, slide 13, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's The Epistemology of the Closet. Now, to make it really simple for you, I've argued that she has these two key ideas. First one is that she doesn't want to use binaries because she feels the second part of the binary is always presented as having less power or less importance. She argues this is wrong. Okay? Key example, look at the first one. A binary, heterosexuality, homosexuality. She argues that the construction of that binary, therefore by presenting homosexuality as the latter part and heterosexuality as the first part, therefore seems to imply that heterosexuality is better than homosexuality. That's what she argues, okay? Of course, she's not saying that should be considered the case. She's saying, I don't like this and I think it should be not the case. So have a little look at that binary argument. Decide whether you can see it at play in our texts anywhere. Can you find examples of a character using a binary in a negative way in order to kind of debilitate or degrade the latter label mentioned in the binary, the second label? Have a look at this binary idea. On Thursday, we're going to be looking at post-colonialism. Chinua Achebe has a similar argument. He basically argues that by saying the phrase England and Africa, you're inherently arguing that Africa is in some way the secondary part. He calls it the foil to England, the foil being this kind of seemingly inferior reflection. That's what of course, he doesn't argue it's an inferior reflection, but he argues that it could be construed in that way and therefore that's wrong. So have a think about how those two arguments connect when we come on to that. Again, there's a reason why we do feminism and post-colonialism together, and Marxism. Marxism is about the marginalisation of people owing to class. Feminism is the marginalisation of people owing to gender. Post-colonialism is the marginalisation of certain sectors of society or countries owing to race. So again, it's all about certain marginalised aspects of society. The following, I think in week 11, we're going to be doing disability studies, obviously the marginalisation of people based on their body. So back to this slide. Second argument then is that the question of gender and the question of sexuality are nonetheless not the same question. Now again, this has kind of become a commonplace that the idea of someone's gender, male or female, is different from their sexuality. Of course, there's many different, identities of gender. There's many different identities of sexuality. But of course, there was once a time when if you were male, it was expected in society that you would have a certain set of sexual beliefs. And if you were female, then accordingly, you'd have a certain set of sexual preferences. Of course, we now know that that's not correct. But again, we're talking about hundreds of years ago when certain things were considered wrong or a sin. So Kosofsky-Sedgwick's argument was huge for queer theory and gay rights because she basically said actually sexuality and gender aren't the same thing. So next slide. I put 5 very, very specific questions here that I'd like you to think about in relation to your text that will allow you to start applying Kosofsky-Sedgwick's arguments. This will also prepare you for assignment 2A, your annotations. I've got, again, another kind of little writing activity on this slide, slide 15, just to help you really get used to some of these ideas. But what I really want to get onto is slide 16. So slide 16 is about your annotations. That's assignment 2A. So here are some more examples for assignment 2A. And of course, you're working on this week. This is what you're doing. I gave out the assignment brief last week. We talked about what you need to do. There's some examples. But here are the examples. Again, just 2 different examples. Have a look at them again. They're both completely acceptable, but quite different. So just a little reminder, if you are using only one theory, say feminism, you do need to know it very well in order to avoid giving a superficial reading. So don't be afraid of really reading over those texts again by Kosofsky, Sedgwick and Rubin. Really make sure you understand the more nuanced, that means the less obvious parts of their argument. It wouldn't be good enough, for example, to just say, oh, okay, here's an example of the traffic in women. Yeah. Here's an example of the idea of a binary. Okay, let's go deeper into some of the more specific parts of their theory. And again, you've got plenty of quotes peppered through this PowerPoint to help you do that. What I want you to think about again, though, for this week is moving on to assignment 2B. So again, as your assignment brief states, go back to it, have a little look, remind yourself what you're doing. You are drafting your peer review. Okay. Now this isn't due until the end of the next week. So end of next week, assignment 2B is due, and you can't start 2B until you've submitted 2A. So 2B is not 2B. Sorry, terrible joke. 2B is not 2B until you have done 2A, and you can't do 2A until this Sunday when you submit it by 11:59 p.m. But I know you want to get ahead, so you're probably thinking, what do I do for 2B? Again, you're giving your 500 words responses. Just got a little diagram here on slide 17 showing you how to respond. So when you download your partner's Word document, on their comment there's a little reply button. All you have to do is click reply and give your response. Now again, we're not going to use vagaries here, good job. That's not helpful to anyone. I think you did a good job here. So if I just wrote in your assignment, I think you did a good job here. It's not giving you any constructive criticism whatsoever. What you need to do instead is pick out the specifics. What exactly do you think works well in the comment? What do you think they could improve upon? Don't be afraid to suggest another quote that they might like to use from the reading. Keep it professional, keep it absolutely academic in tone. Imagine that these comments were going to be shown on the national news, for example. Imagine they were going into your grad school application folder. Treat them seriously. Things not to do. It sounds obvious. Don't write less than 500 words in your comments. Don't use all of your words in one comment box and then write nothing to the other comments. You don't have to write back to every comment because you just might not have the word space, but do try and write back to a fair majority of your partner's comments. Don't get personal. It's quite rare that I'll see something like this, but don't write something on your partner's piece like, this is completely wrong. You clearly haven't done the reading. Nothing like that. Keep it very professional in tone. So something like, perhaps spending more focus on this part of the reading than name the part might enhance your reading here. That would be a polite way of saying, I think you need to go back and read this text. You can say something like, I feel that you've misinterpreted the quote here. That's okay. You're keeping it polite. So again, remember the big thing. I like your analysis of that. Who cares? Let's be honest, who cares if you like it? You're not there to like it. You're there to critically examine it and give an objective response that keeps to the facts and the points. Saying something like, I like this, doesn't really offer any sort of really real specificity. Okay. Again, if I graded your assignment and I just said, I really like this assignment, period. It's not helping you at all. It's not giving you any sort of real response. Okay. So that's pretty much your assignment 2B. That's your peer review. Remember though, you can't start it until next Monday when you get your peer review partner assigned. That will happen automatically when you submit. However, if your partner doesn't submit their assignment on time, which does happen sometimes, and remember, you are forbidden from doing that for this assignment. You don't submit on time for 2A, you lose the whole grade. Because I can't have you submit late, because I can't have another student have less time to do their peer review than another student, because that's inherently unfair. So it's on you. You are responsible here. You are the part of the team. This is your role in the chain. You must submit 2A on time. When you've done that, your partner can then pick up the assignment. They can give their comments. So that won't happen until Monday when you get it assigned. If you do not have a paper assigned, sometimes the system does make a glitch. Do let me know on the Monday. Just say, hi, Dr. Kane, I'm sorry, but I can't see this partner. That's absolutely fine. I can manually go in and override and assign you a partner. Okay. So tasks for this week then. Let's just remind yourself, what am I doing? You've just done the feminism lecture. Well done. And again, don't be superficial on those readings. Do make sure you've done them, okay? Because you will need to maybe return to this for assignment 4 and assignment 3, the podcast. Also do the post-colonial theory readings for next week. On slide 19, I've got the readings that you need to do for that, okay? And you need to submit assignment 2A, your annotations, by 11:59 p.m. this Sunday. No exceptions, okay? So I hope that's given you some sort of context and background. Any questions, just email me, let me know. I am holding virtual office hours. Quite a few of you have signed up to those. We've been Skyping and sending messages like that. That's absolutely fine. So don't be afraid to do that, okay? Remember, assignment 2A due at the end of this week. That's pretty much your duty done for this week, all right? Let me know if you need anything at all, and that's pretty much it. I'll see you again on Thursday, okay?